24. George plied the priest with far more drink than was good for him, but even deep in his cups, the man didn't drop so much as another hint about the beast they faced, or the best way to kill it. Which was unusual in itself, he had to admit. What man was so afraid of something he refused to talk about it at all? Didn't he want it dead? He turned to ask Melitta, for with her mind-reading magic it was possible that she had caught more from the man than he had, but he was disappointed to discover that she'd disappeared. Back to her chamber, he assumed, resting before tomorrow's journey. Sure enough, when he'd managed to roll out of bed the following morning and drink enough to dispel his lingering hangover, he found Melitta at breakfast in the common room downstairs, wearing her breastplate and a grim expression. "Good morning, my lady," he wished her warmly. Melitta eyed him over her cup, drinking deeply before she replied, "No morning is good when the day must end in killing a unicorn." George spat out a mouthful of water. "You're killing a unicorn? But those things are purity itself. Killing one would condemn you to hell for eternity. Don't do it, my lady, I beg you." Melitta slammed her cup down on the table. "I never said I'd do it. You did though. You promised the priest that you'd kill his unicorn. And virgin or not, I won't help you do it. You're on your own for this one." She rose and made to leave. If she left, he stood no chance against the dragon. Ever. George grasped her wrist. "My lady, Melitta, please. Don't go. I need you." Melitta wrenched free. "I'm not killing a unicorn, George." Possibilities spiraled through his mind. Slowly he began, what if we don't have to? What if we just trapped it, like we did with the boar? Melitta snorted. "Like that worked? Or don't you remember being run out of town without our things? And I killed the beast, in case you've forgotten." George waved away her worries. "This isn't the same thing. I'll speak to the priest before we set out. I know all he needs is to get the beast away from the building site, so it's safe to build the abbey. If we trap it, then he can do what he likes with it. We can earn our money and be on our way to fight something more deserving of death, like a dragon." He'd sparked her interest, he knew, but he wasn't sure if it was enough. "Imagine the tales they'll tell about us if we not only killed a dozen giants, but captured a unicorn too," George added. "6, not a dozen," Melitta replied. "And you only killed 2 of them." "But a unicorn," he wheedled. "Have you ever seen a unicorn?" She sighed. "No. If I hadn't seen one in the priest's memories yesterday, I still wouldn't believe the creature exists. And I certainly couldn't bring myself to kill one. A lady who has killed a dozen with one blow and a wild boar that was terrorizing a town and 4 giants. My lady, if you decide something must die, may God help anyone who stands in your way." George meant every word, but he wasn't sure Melitta believed him. A slight smile curved at her lips. "Flatterer. You make me sound so frightening, yet I suspect I will be little more than virgin bait for the beast, if anything." George placed his hand over his heart. "I swear by my own life that I find you terrifying, my lady." She seemed to measure him with her eyes for a long moment, before she gave a nod. He hoped he had passed her inspection. "You promised to put your magic potion on my new boots," she said. He bowed his head. "Indeed I did. In all the excitement last night, I forgot. I will remedy that tonight, if you allow me to." "Before we must face the unicorn, or after?" "Before, of course. When you meet your first unicorn, you must wear your best boots." Melitta laughed. "I must be mad, listening to you. And yet your words have untold power. My first unicorn. I like the sound of that too much to refuse. We will go with this priest, see his unicorn, and if he still insists the beast must be killed, then we will decline the task and be on our way." She made it sound so easy. Yet for her it would be, George was sure of it. He swallowed his last mouthful of breakfast. "We ride." An hour later, ride they did, but without the priest, who had claimed illness after drinking too much the previous night. He gave them directions to the lake campsite, and promised he would catch up to them. Melitta waited until she was out of his earshot before expressing her doubts that he'd arrive before they'd dealt with the beast, and George had to agree. Still, he rode to battle alongside a veritable goddess of war, whose eager enthusiasm was more contagious than any plague. Oh, but what a pleasurable plague! George felt his own courage rising every time he glanced at her. Yes, it was his courage. Nothing else, for nothing could happen between them. Fairy tales were for knights and ladies and royalty. Shoemakers were never the hero who won the heart of a fair lady. One day some prince would ask for her hand and she would be someone else's lady. Never his. George knew his place and counted himself fortunate that today it was at her side. What more could he ask for, except victory? 25. By the time the lake came into view between the trees, Melitta had to admit they had a good plan. The priest had not put in an appearance, so they decided to trap the beast and wait for the priest to come. When he did, they would demand payment, or release the unicorn. The brickmaker's camp was just as the priest had described it, and the men there were only too happy to direct them to the well. Melitta was tempted to walk around the lake right away, but she agreed with George that it was best to wait a day or two for the priest to catch up to them. Surely he couldn't be more than a day behind. On the morrow, George told the men he would save them from the unicorn. Cheers erupted, and the laborers broke out a barrel of mead they'd been saving for a special occasion. Melitta didn't tell George they believed it would be his last night alive, for they'd seen the unicorn kill several of their number before they'd retreated to the other side of the lake. Much like the boar, when it attacked, it lowered its head and charged with its horn first, attempting to impale or gore its target. For the first time, Melitta wondered if their plan could work. She'd counted on the unicorn being a sort of skittish horse, not some fully armed, more deadly version of one of King Eric's war destriers. If one attacked her, she would most certainly fight back to protect her own life, purity be damned. How pure could a murderous beast be, anyhow? Something to worry about in the morning, she told herself, as she rolled herself in her cloak by the fire. The men had offered them space in the hut they shared, but Melitta had declined the offer. With that many men in a confined space all night, the smell would be unbearable. George slept on the other side of the fire, apparently not bothered at all by what awaited them on the morrow. He was a strange man, confident as the finest knight at one moment, and humble as the lowliest servant the next. "You should rest, my lady," he said softly. So he wasn't asleep after all. Melitta squinted at him through the flames. "How did you know I wasn't asleep yet?" He chuckled. "The lining of your cloak is silk, and it rustles when you move. When you are restless, it sounds like wind rustling through the leaves above. Sleep, my lady. Tomorrow will come whether you are awake to greet it or not, and our fate is already written. You won't change the outcome of tomorrow's battle by worrying over it. You're not worried about dying tomorrow? If we do something wrong? Tomorrow anything could happen. We could live or die. Take a wound, catch the plague, step on a snake, be crushed by a horse, be hit by a falling tree, and die. Life is short but precious. Tomorrow, your day will end in you seeing a unicorn for the first time. Whatever else happens is already ordained." Melitta frowned. "I don't believe that. We have free will. We can make our own fate. I left the castle. You left your shoemaking shop. You can't know what will happen tomorrow or what choices we will make. Worrying about it won't change that. You'd make a good court philosopher, George. Have you ever considered that?" George snorted. "Me at court? Surely you jest. That's your place, my lady, not mine. He sounded so sad as he said it too. Almost as though he wished. "Good night, George," she said. "And sweet dreams to you, my lady." My lady. There was something in those words, and the way he said it. Part mockery, part respect, and a lot of longing. She'd miss that when they parted ways. But not yet. They had a unicorn to face on the morrow, and all else paled into insignificance. 26. The men making bricks wished them luck as George and Melitta set off around the lake for the construction site. Melitta was unusually quiet, her eyes darting around as though searching for something. Perhaps she expected the unicorn to pop out of the trees to surprise her. Did she know something about unicorns that he did not? Probably. She seemed to know a lot about a lot of things, which constantly surprised him. He'd thought that court ladies spent all of their time drinking, talking, and perhaps sewing. Certainly nothing particularly useful. Maybe Melitta was different, or maybe he'd just been wrong. Yet if she had fit in so well in court, what was she doing out here with him? Unless the goddess of war was lying about running away from a marriage that her parents had arranged for her, she was here because she wanted to be. Because she wanted to be with him, a tiny voice inside his head taunted him. Impossible. Georgie knew the score. It was a unicorn she wanted, not him. After all, she was by his side, not sparing him a glance, whilst she strained her eyes searching for the elusive beast. The abbey was almost exactly as the priest had described it. A brick cellar carved into the cleared hillside, with the hill itself crowned by a circlet of stone that George took to be the well fed by a miraculous spring, or whatever it was. Magical, miraculous, blessed by a saint. The priest hadn't been too clear about that. All he had said was that the well had the power to heal the sick. Now George believed in miracles as much as the next man, but most miraculous wells that he had heard of worked their magic through the cleanliness of the water. No more magic required. In a city, clean water might be in short supply. Yet here, with such a large lake on their doorstep, why one would go to the trouble of digging a well for water? Perhaps there was something to the stories after all. Not that George had any intention of needing the healing waters from the well. Together, he and Melitta would trap the unicorn, then return to camp and claim the reward when the priest arrived. When Melitta reached the crown of the hill, she stopped. Turning around to look back the way that she'd come, a smile lit her face as she took in the view. "It's so beautiful," she breathed. "The view across the lake and over the forest. Though I would never join a religious community, I could live here." "Why not? Are you not pious enough?" George teased. Melitta closed her eyes and shook her head. "I grew up in a convent, remember? I know what life in the cloister is like. Reporting to the chapter house every morning for your chores, and then again every evening to report that they were done. It is all work and prayer and drudgery. Some found joy in it, but not I. Being closed within walls like that, even if you could see out. It was like being in a prison or a tomb. I wished to live in the world, not separate from it." So this is what the unicorn is fighting to protect? The freedom of this hill in the forest? A domain without walls? George asked. Melitta shrugged. "I do not know. If the unicorn were here, perhaps I could read its mind. But as it is not, its motivation shall remain a mystery." No unicorn? Now it was George's turn to scan their surroundings. Of course she was right. There was no sign of the beast. Merely the grassy rise and the big brick pit. "Can you do that? Read the minds of animals, I mean?" George asked. "Sometimes. When they use natural instinct, often there are no thoughts to read. A hunting beast usually only knows hunger, and a hunted beast only knows fear. They do not wonder, what if?" Melitta managed a small smile. "Perhaps they all subscribe to the philosophy you described last night. They do not worry, and so they sleep better for it. George peered into the cellar. It certainly looked big enough for their needs. But it was deeper than he'd thought. The fall from the top might kill a man or a beast. "Do you think our plan will work?" George asked abruptly. A sudden thought struck him and he glanced around again, worried. Perhaps we'd best not talk of it. After all, a unicorn is a kind of horse and horses understand what we say. So if the beast heard us and knew our plan, it might also be smart enough to avoid it. "The beast is not close enough to hear us," Melitta stated with all the confidence of a woman who knew she was talking about. "Perhaps there is something we must do to summon it." What did the priest do? Drink the water from the well? She moved toward the well, her head darting around like a bird's at every step. George's heart rose into his throat. He would not place her in danger. Not again. "No, I should do that," he said. "I did not mean that bit about you being virgin bait. I know you're a better marksman than me, so if anyone should be the bait, it is myself." He managed a sickly smile. "If you save me from the beast, I will make shoes for you for the rest of your life." Melitta tilted her head to the side, as if considering his offer. "Very well," she said slowly. "You draw some water. I shall stand back, and we shall see whether there is any truth to this nonsense about unicorns preferring virgins." Her eyes glinted with mischief, and for the first time George doubted. He'd believed her to be a virtuous lady, but he'd heard talk of something called courtly love. He dismissed it as mere wind, sonnets and other words and such, expressing ideas and ideals that had little to do with the reality of marriage. Another thought struck him. What if that was what Melitta had run away from? A man at court who had forced her against her will, dishonored her, and that was why she had been so adamant that the giants must die. Anger burned in his breast. When he escorted her home, he would ask the name of the vile wretch. George might not be a knight, but he had honor, and her honor would not be satisfied until the man had breathed his last. Melitta was laughing softly. "I meant you, you fool. No man would dare touch one of the ladies of Queen Margarita's court without the lady's permission. The queen would castrate him before subjecting him to a slow and painful death that he justly deserved. I am as chaste as I choose to be. If the beast does not attack you, then we shall know that unicorns have a fondness for virgins. For you are one, are you not?" Oh, by all that was holy! George's cheeks grew hot as he blushed like a maiden. Though he longed to tell her she was correct, he refused to lie to her. "I am not," he said shortly. "So the beast will react to me as savagely as he did to the priest. May your purity keep you safe." He unhooked the bucket from the side of the well, checked to make sure it was firmly tied to the coiled rope, then flung the pail into the depths. A splash sounded deep below, and George grasped the rope to haul it up once more. Melitta's voice was scarcely more than a whisper. "George." He continued hauling up the bucket, but his eyes were no longer on the dark depths. It seemed just a shimmer between the trees, but it rippled, moving faster than anything he'd seen. Then the horse stepped out of the trees, and George could only stare. The rope fell from his fingers as he took in the legendary steed. He had never seen a finer piece of horseflesh. This beast belonged in a king's stable, at the very least. Or an emperor's, perhaps. Yet when the animal raised his head, and with it the wickedly sharp horn that was easily the length of George's forearm, George knew this beast belonged in no stable in heaven or on earth. The unicorn tossed its head in apparent agreement, before it pawed the ground. George tensed. Now he would live or he would die. He prayed that the plan would work. Or that Melitta would succeed when he... The beast started forward and George bolted. He darted this way and then that, knowing that to run in a straight line would be to court death. Death by impalement. He circled the well. Once. Twice. On the third time he broke and ran, heading downhill in the way they'd decided. The unicorn's hooves thundered behind him. So close. But if George turned to see how close, he would die. 5 more steps. 4. 3. George uttered a prayer. A wordless cry that this would work. 2. 1. George closed his eyes and leaped into nothingness. 27. Melitta's breath caught in her throat as George jumped into the cellar. She was so certain he'd fall to his death, but he managed to catch onto the opposite wall, sliding down it to the earth floor, apparently unharmed. Melitta breathed again. The unicorn reached the edge of the pit, and it appeared to hesitate, perhaps sharing Melitta's doubts that it would survive the jump. Then it reached the same conclusion Melitta had: if the man could walk around after jumping in there, then he would be fine. The beast backed up a few paces, then bunched its muscles and leaped right at George. Melitta screamed out a warning. He scrambled up the wall like a monkey, digging his hands into the mortar like his life depended on it. Which perhaps it did, for if the unicorn charged at him in the confined space of the cellar, it could still kill him. Without thinking, Melitta knelt by the lip of the hole, reaching down to help him up. Together they dragged him over the edge and lay on the grass, gasping. Below, the unicorn let out an angry scream like no horse Melitta had ever heard before. George rose to his knees. It worked, he marveled. The beast is trapped just like we planned it. He beamed at her, eyes shining with relief. And I'm still alive. Confident one moment, as humble as dirt the next, Melitta reminded herself. No, she'd never met a man like George before, and she probably never would again. He leaped to his feet. I should go and see if the priest has arrived. And tell him his abbey is safe. He offered Melitta his hand. She declined. I'll stay here and make sure the unicorn doesn't escape. And as she watched, she would fix every detail in her mind for later, because she doubted she'd ever see another unicorn. George hesitated for a moment, before he came to a decision. All right. If the priest doesn't arrive before the midday meal, I'll return with some food for you. Wait. Melitta held up her hand, bit her lip, and reached with her mind. She found the brickmakers on the very edge of her awareness, on the other side of the lake. Most of their minds were intent on the clay they worked with, or irritated that some beast had stepped in the molds before the clay was properly dry. But one mind bubbled with anticipation, half hoping and yet not daring to hope that George would succeed. The priest. Melitta withdrew. It took a moment for her vision to clear, so she shook her head a few times before she said, He's there. I can feel him. George sighed in relief. Then I will bring him and your midday meal. Melitta nodded and waited for George to be on his way before she clambered to her feet. Sleeping on the ground was not the most comfortable thing she'd ever done, as her aching body chose to remind her. If she returned home after this, at least there would be soft beds every night. But a night's discomfort was worth it to see a unicorn, Melitta reflected as she peered down at the beast. It hadn't moved from the spot where it had landed. It raised its head and let out another horrible, almost human scream. I don't like walls either, she told the animal, but George will be back soon with that priest. He'll release you, one way or another. Just be patient. The unicorn let out a huffy snort, just like any normal impatient horse. Melitta moved higher up the hill, so that she could lean against one of the few remaining trees that gave her a good vantage point from which she could watch the beast in the cellar. Of course, the view of the lake was beautiful too, reflecting the blue sky above. Almost as pretty as the ocean at home on a clear day. The sound of hoofs pounding on turf dragged her out of her daydream. Melitta watched in frozen horror as the unicorn, which had somehow miraculously escaped from the cellar, charged up the hill right for her. 28. At first, when George told the priest they'd captured the unicorn, he'd been excited. Almost as eager as George to go back and get Melitta. But when George told him the tale of how he had trapped the beast, which was still alive, the priest's enthusiasm waned significantly. First he had to see to his horse, make sure the beast was fed and brushed and tethered so that it could not escape. Then he needed to change out of his traveling clothes, for such dusty garments were disrespectful to wear when visiting such a holy site. Then he needed to relieve himself, which took an inordinately long amount of time, at least in George's opinion. Finally, when the priest appeared to be ready, George told him of his promise to bring a midday meal for Melitta. The priest's eyes lit up at this, as he busied himself putting together a veritable feast for the three of them to share on the hilltop. Privately wondering how they were supposed to carry so much food, let alone eat it, George set off around the lake again, with the priest staggering along behind him. Urgency quickened George's steps, though he did not understand why. Melitta was more than capable of defending herself, and there was no way the unicorn could get out of the cellar. George himself had struggled to climb the wall. A beast with hooves and no hands stood no chance. Yet still he worried and wondered why. If the priest's far-off abbey knew of the miraculous properties of the well water, then plenty of others must know of it too. At any time a knight might come on the quest for the water, and if such a man found Melitta at the well, who knew what might happen? The man might try to carry her off or otherwise harm her. Worse, he might try to seduce her or at least win her heart. George himself might have no chance of making an impression on her heart, but that didn't mean he wanted some noble knight to win it instead. George was a man after all and as subject to jealousy as anyone else. George burst out of the trees at a run and immediately knew something was wrong. Melitta was not by the side of the cellar where he'd left her, which could only mean something had happened to her. George would never forgive himself. 29. Time seemed to slow down, for which Melitta was deeply grateful. She ducked out of the way, hearing her tunic tear as the unicorn's horn raked its way through it. Her skin burned, and she knew she'd been grazed by the beast too. She ran to the only structure she could see, the well. Putting the stone circle between her and the beast, she dared to turn around to see how close it was. Only to discover that the unicorn still stood beside the tree where she had been standing, only moments earlier. Melitta crept around the well, in order to get a better view of the beast. Her mouth dropped open in surprise. In trying to impale her, the unicorn had in fact pinned itself to the tree with its own horn. Try as it might to yank itself free, the beast was stuck. Fearing that it might free itself once again, Melitta ran down the hill for the bag of belongings they'd brought with them. The length of rope they hadn't needed to get George out of the cellar was what she wanted now. Melitta threw a coil of rope over the beast's neck, securing it with some difficulty as the beast struggled with the tree. Next, she tied the makeshift halter to the tree, looping the rope several times around the trunk before tying it with the strongest knot she knew. There! Let the beast try and break free from that. Behind her, the horrible unicorn scream sounded again. Melitta whirled, but there was no other beast. Just the one before her. The unicorn tied to the tree let out a frustrated snort. An answering snort came from further down the hill. There couldn't be two beasts. There couldn't be. And yet. Melitta checked to make sure the unicorn was securely tied to the tree, then made her way down to the edge of the cellar. To her amazement, there was also a unicorn in the cellar. Looking from one beast to the other, Melitta marveled. Two unicorns, not one. She would never forget this day. The beast in the cellar let out another scream, then flopped over on its side, panting. Melitta might not be an expert on horses or unicorns, but she knew this wasn't a good sign. When the beast screamed again, the second one answered it. For the first time, Melitta dared to slip inside a unicorn's mind. But all she met was a blaze of unbearable pain. Pain in her arm? No, the pain was not hers. It belonged to the unicorn. It had broken its foreleg when it landed in the cellar, and it could neither walk nor escape. The second beast had come to its rescue, she assumed. But what use was another unicorn to one trapped in the cellar with a broken leg? Melitta? Melitta. George's shouts became increasingly urgent. Melitta rose from a crouch and waved. He had the priest with him, she noted. Wonderful. The priest could put the poor animal out of its misery. Or perhaps he knew something about healing horses. She certainly didn't know enough to do anything for the animal. How did it get out? George burst out, catching sight of the second unicorn. Melitta wanted to sink back down to the ground, she suddenly felt so exhausted. But she didn't want to look weak in front of the priest, who was still the client after all. It didn't, she said, pointing. The first beast is in the cellar. The second beast came to save it, I think. She peered into the cellar again. Come here. I think it's broken its leg. We have to help it somehow. 2 unicorns, the priest breathed, so eager to see inside the cellar that he almost knocked Melitta over the edge. Are you going to put out of its misery, Father? She asked. Or miraculously heal its leg? The priest's eyes shone, but he didn't seem to see her anymore. Miracles. Miracles on such a holy site, he muttered. That's what we must have. A miracle. Like a man possessed, he headed for the well. No, Father. George shouted, running after the priest to hold him back. But the priest would not be stopped. He drew a pail of water from the well, but he didn't stop to drink it this time. No third unicorn appeared to attack him, either. With the bucket dangling from one arm, the priest climbed down the ladder Melitta hadn't seen before into the cellar with the injured unicorn. He will be killed, George said. We must stop him. Melitta shook her head. Wait. He said the water can work miracles. The unicorn is the guardian of the well. Surely the well would want to help him. Down in the cellar, the priest blessed the bucket of water, before pouring it in a thin trickle over the beast's leg. When the bucket was empty, he tossed it up to the grass at Melitta's feet. Fetch me more water, the priest commanded. George hurried to obey. The priest pulled the beast's leg straight, then poured the second bucket over it in the same manner. 5 times he sent George back for more water until the cellar floor was awash, but neither man or beast seemed to care. When George brought up the empty bucket, Melitta filled it with grass instead and sent him back to the priest with it. Perhaps he is hungry, she said softly. When a witch used powerful healing magic on me, I remember I woke absolutely starving. The priest grabbed a handful of grass, which the unicorn happily licked from his hand. Remarkable, he said. Are you going to kill him? Melitta demanded. From where she was standing, there was absolutely no doubt that the priest was tending to a male unicorn. Never, the priest replied, reaching out to stroke the unicorn's flank. He looked up at George and Melitta, standing on the edge above him, as if seeing them for the first time. We must build steps to get him out of the cellar immediately. You do what you must, George said firmly. We only came to catch a unicorn for you, and we caught 2. It seems to me we have done our job, and it only remains for you to pay the sum that was promised, and we shall be on our way. Building is best left to those who know how to do it. An abbey with a holy well that works miracles, and 2 unicorn guardians. This will be the holiest place for miles around. The priest nodded. You shall be richly rewarded. And that, Melitta reflected, might be the first time a hero was ever paid for not slaughtering the beast he was contracted to kill. And the world would be a better place for it. 30. Loaded with more coin than George thought fair for capturing what were little more than angry horses, he and Melitta set off that evening in search of an inn where they could spend the night. Yet as the sun began to sink, the largest settlement they encountered was a cluster of houses with not enough people to support an inn. One of the farmers offered space in his barn and George was of half a mind to accept, but Melitta shook her head slightly, so he declined the offer. Instead, they bought food supplies for several days' travel and continued on their way. By nightfall, George was ready to set up camp in the first clearing they saw beside the road. Melitta looked just as tired, so when he saw a likely spot, he called a halt. This time she didn't argue. They soon had a fire going, and Melitta demonstrated she was quite the expert at toasting bread and cheese. "Where did you learn to do that?" George demanded over his third golden brown morsel. Melitta laughed. "In the convent, when I was a little girl. Mother loved to weave and sometimes grew quite distracted by whatever project she was working on. One of the older nuns used to toast bread and cheese for me, but she died of a summer fever, so I took out a toasting fork and tried to do it myself. I got burned a lot to start with, but then I got better. By the time Mother noticed I was so good at it, I was allowed to make hers too." She glanced at the sack of food. "Is there pork?" Slices of cold roast pork or a smoked leg of ham crisp up quite nicely over a hot fire. George dug out a joint of meat he couldn't identify in the firelight, and sliced some off for her. "If it's as good as what you do with cheese, my belly is ready to worship you and your cooking skills forever." Melitta let out a decidedly unladylike snort. "You should see what Queen Margarita's cooks create for feast days. I can cook well enough not to starve, but they can roast meat so that it fair melts in your mouth. They can make cabbage fit for kings, and their dumplings. I used to eat so many dumplings it's a wonder I wasn't sick. I used to have competitions with the little princesses, to see who could eat the most dumplings. I was bigger so I always won, but when the little prince joined in, he ate too many and he was sick all night. The queen forbade any more contests after that." George's blood ran cold. One moment she was the girl of his dreams and the next, so far out of reach his dreams were laughable. Melitta was raised with royalty and she deserved a prince. Not him. "It sounds so perfect," he said slowly, uncorking a skin of mead that had come with the food. He drank deeply, then passed it to Melitta. "If life in the castle was so good, why did you ever leave?" She took a swig. "I think it was the princess's betrothal gown. She was to be betrothed to some neighboring prince, and both of them younger than I am. I looked at the dress and the court, and I realized that if I didn't do something, this was all my future would hold. Sewing dresses for the queen and her daughters. Watching them marry princes while I—" She sighed. "Mother offered to make a match for me. Any man I wanted at court," she said. "Queen Margarita has always regarded me like one of her children, for she and Mother have been friends since I was a baby, so she would have made sure I married a man befitting my station. But when I looked at all the young noblemen practicing their archery or swordplay in the training grounds, I wanted none of them." Melitta tipped the skin up, gulping down almost as much as George had. "It's the mind reading, you see. It's a curse as much as it's a blessing. For all the couples who claim to be happily married, I know the truth. I know who is loved and who is not, who is terrible in the bedchamber and who is such a perfect lover, anyone would swoon to be with them. I know everyone inside and out, their secrets and their shames, and no one ever changes. I was trapped in a gilded cage from which I thought I should never get out, until that night came. And then you, calling for those who wanted to be heroes. And you picked me. Out of all those boys who talked of nothing else for days, lining up to be considered for the apprenticeship, you picked me." She drank again but spilled some of it down her tunic. Swaying, she tried to mop up the mess. George couldn't tear his eyes away from the patch of skin showing at her belly. "What knight?" he asked, trying and failing to curb his jealousy. "Sir, I think his name was Sir Chase. Highly skilled at archery. But not so skilled at diplomacy. He offended the queen and she banished him from her court. I never saw him but the once. It was what he said that stuck with me though. He said a hero was more than a sword. More than his weapons and armor and skill on the battlefield. That his wit and honor were worth more than anything. And that to a true hero, every woman was equal to a queen when it came to who was worth saving." Melitta tugged her tunic down and for the first time, George saw the dark stains across it. The cloth was torn too, with the worst stains creeping from the ragged edges. "Is that blood?" he demanded, reaching for the hem of her tunic. Melitta glanced down. "Probably. I should wash. I'd intended to order some hot water so that I might bathe properly once we reached an inn, but—" "Is that your blood?" "I imagine so." Neither of the unicorns was bleeding. George jumped to his feet and paced around the fire. "We should have stopped at that hamlet, where you could have received aid. We should have used some of that holy water to heal you. If I'd known you were hurt, my lady, please forgive me. Let me see what I can do to help." "There's no need," Melitta said, yanking up the hem of her tunic so that her belly was bared. "Look, the cuts have closed already. The graze is still a little raw, I'll allow, but by morning it will have healed too." George's mouth went dry. He shoved away the inappropriate thoughts that crowded into his head, to really look at what she showed him. He traced the line that matched the rip across her tunic. How had she not been eviscerated? When did this happen? "Today, when the second unicorn charged me. I didn't move fast enough, so her horn scraped a little skin off on her way past." Melitta shrugged. "It hurt at first, but then I forgot about it. The other beast needed healing more than I did." Down went the soft wool covering her belly. "Today?" George shook his head. "It wasn't possible. Normal people don't heal that fast." Melitta managed a smile. "Mind reading isn't normal either. My gifts were never particularly useful in the castle. Now I don't mind them so much." "But how?" "When I was younger, I fell ill. So ill my mother thought I would die. The queen found a witch who specializes in healing, and she tried her magic on me. She cast a spell so powerful she fainted for days afterwards," Mother said. "When I awoke, I was healed completely. The sickness was gone and it has not returned. It wasn't until a few weeks later, when I tripped on the stairs and barked my shin, that I realized what else had changed. Within hours, my skin had healed itself, so even I could barely see the damage the next morning. I have never known a day of illness since, and all the times I pricked my fingers while sewing became little more than a momentary nuisance." George laughed bitterly. "I wish my fairy godmother had given me gifts like yours. Instead, I think too much, so I am slow to act. But she gifted me with fleet feet, so that when I am in danger, they will take me far and fast to save me, like a coward. She gave me an enchanted sword too, but I lost that the same day. To a dragon." Melitta headed for her saddlebags and rifled through them until she found a fresh tunic. She turned her back on George and tugged off the torn one. He stared at the fine curves of her shoulders, her back, her hips as they framed her bottom, wishing, longing for what he couldn't have, before she smoothed a fresh tunic over all that temptation. She flung her cloak around her shoulders and returned to the fire. She sat beside George, reaching over to pat his knee. "You're not a coward, you know. You stood at my side and shot those giants, showing no fear. Why, you even chased one down. If you hadn't run from the boar or the unicorn, both of them might have killed you. You're the bravest hero I've ever met, for you faced all of those things with a maiden at your side. I'm no hero, I know that, though I try. I couldn't kill the unicorn yesterday, and when that giant tackled me to the ground, he would have killed me for certain, if you hadn't shot him first. You may not be a knight, but you have the wits and honor to be one, if you wished it." Her eyes seemed to burn into his as they reflected the flames. "Return with me to Queen Margarita's court at Arros. Once I tell her all the things you have done, she will knight you, I am sure of it." Her hand was warm on his, but George knew he could never accept what she offered. "I cannot. I ran from a dragon once, and my cowardice still haunts me. I will not rest until the dragon is dead, or I am." Instead of turning away from him in disgust, Melitta's lovely eyes widened. "What happened?" Swallowing back his shame, George told her. Every painful detail, from the first folly of wanting to face the dragon in the field, to his final ignominious defeat. And when his voice died away, he found her head resting on his shoulder, for she was fast asleep. Laughing quietly to himself, George gently laid her on the ground and wrapped her cloak around her. He supposed his story was boring to a girl who was the earthly embodiment of the goddess of war. He banked the fire and dug out his own cloak so that he might get some sleep too. 31. Melitta woke up warmer than she expected. When she opened her eyes, she realized why. Somehow during the night she'd cuddled up to George, and she could feel the heat of him even through the thickness of her cloak. She edged away from him, wishing that they had managed to find an inn to spend the night in. She almost wished they'd accepted the offer of that barn, but she wouldn't go that far. That particular hamlet had been poor enough before the giants turned up, and when travel slowed along that particular road, the giants hadn't been averse to stealing from them. Now, with their best breeding stock long gone into the giants' bellies and their women sent who knew where, some of those men had been desperate enough to consider robbing travelers for their own profit. Not wanting to be their first victim, Melitta had asked to buy supplies from the farmers. If she'd paid twice what the food was worth, no one had commented on it. She hoped that the return of travelers along their road, now the giants were gone, might help them more than turning bandit themselves. Or it might do nothing. Melitta would never know, as she wasn't likely to travel this road again. She sighed as she crouched down to stir up the fire, searching for a hot coal among the ashes. She soon had it burning merrily again, with flames hot enough to toast some of yesterday's bread. Even with the fire going, the brisk morning wasn't warm enough for her to want to take off her cloak. Not for the first time, she wished she hadn't cut off her hair as the breeze sent icy fingers tickling her neck. Melitta pulled up her hood. "Are you cold, my lady?" George crouched down beside her and set another piece of wood on the fire. "From behind, you looked like a witch casting some sort of spell." Melitta laughed. "There are those who say that my mind-reading gift makes me a sort of witch, if not the spell-casting kind. But seeing as you called my cooking magical last night, perhaps I am casting a spell over breakfast after all." She offered him the stick she'd used to skewer her toast. Melitta rose and busied herself saddling her horse and fastening her saddlebags. She'd remembered George's story about the dragon last night, and more importantly, she'd remembered her unanswered questions. "You never did tell me. Where is the dragon we're supposed to face, and when will we do it?" she asked. George dropped his food in the fire. "What? You told me last night how you fought the dragon and failed. I saw in your mind that you believe we can win together. So when are we doing this? Or am I still not ready?" Much though she hated to admit it, Melitta didn't feel any more like a hero than when she'd first set out. Without her bow, her archery hadn't improved. Her sword skills were still rudimentary at best, and she might have killed a few men and the boar before she helped trap 2 unicorns, but none of that felt particularly heroic. Whereas a dragon, that was the sort of monster only a hero could conquer. George uncorked the water skin and took a drink. "My lady, you were ready the very day I met you, and no mistake. If anyone can defeat a dragon, it is you. After all I've seen you do already, I have no doubt of that. It is me who may not be ready, and to tell the truth, I may never be. What if I run away again?" Did he really believe that? Melitta's heart swelled in her chest. With pride no less. "I couldn't have done any of what I have without you. All of the monsters we've vanquished, we've done it together," she said warmly. "And with the assistance of your fleet feet, as you call them. A hero is more than his sword or armor. It takes cunning and honor and so much more to do what we have done. We shall find this dragon, face it, and we shall defeat it. And we'll do it without enchanted swords and other such silly things. We'll have what other knights won't. We'll have a plan." For a moment George raised his eyes to her and they were filled with hope. I want to believe you, but what if I run? I will never forgive myself if I leave you to face the beast alone. Melitta smiled. Last night, you told me of all the men who had faced the dragon before you. How they stood and fought, until they died. Whatever we do and however we do this, there must be a way to put those fleet feet of yours to good use. They helped you outrun a dragon once. I bet you could do it again. We'll need a bigger cellar though. Have you ever seen a dragon? They have wings. They can fly. Melitta swallowed. No, I've never seen one. But you have. Which is why I need your help. What do you say, George? Time to go kill a dragon? George bowed low. Whatever my lady wishes. 32. Casmiris had changed little since George left, he found, as they entered the gates. But the people of Casmiris, they had altered considerably, and not for the better. An air of melancholy surrounded the town like some deadly miasma. Though it was Sunday, everyone wore dark, funereal colors. George's blood ran cold. He stopped the first man he recognized, a baker he'd often bought bread from. Please tell me. What ails the city? Is it plague? For nothing else could send a whole city into mourning, surely. The baker shook off George's grasp. By all that's holy, I hope not. Is a dragon not enough for our sins? When I think of those poor girls, I won't let my daughters leave the house now, for it is not safe. The sooner some knight dispatches the dragon, the happier we'll all be. He got no more information from the next two people he asked, so George headed for an inn frequented by wealthy merchant visitors to the city. A more costly establishment than he might have chosen for himself, but he had a bag full of the abbey's coin and Melitta's comfort to think of. Sure enough, when he showed he had the coin to pay for the room, the landlord lost interest in him, directing a chambermaid to take them to their rooms. Melitta ordered hot water to be sent up so that she might wash, and George left her to her ablutions, promising to spend the time listening to gossip in the taproom downstairs. The common room was nearly empty, and the merchants George met knew little of the goings-on in the city, being but recently arrived themselves. Finally, in desperation, he asked the barman what he knew about the dragon. Only that the king has promised half the kingdom and a lordship to the man who slays the beast, the barman replied. Many have tried but none have succeeded. He squinted at George. Are you thinking of trying your luck? Perhaps, George replied defensively. The barman laughed. Take my advice, Sir Knight. Climb back on your horse and ride far away from here. That dragon brings death to anyone who goes near it, and none can withstand it. The only reason I stay in the city is that it is too dangerous to travel. The beast preys on travelers now too, as his appetite grows. Soon, we may not have any trade at all, if the dragon develops a taste for merchants too. Talk turned to the current high prices of trade goods, which the merchants toasted with another round of wine, so George thanked the barman and headed back upstairs to share what he'd learned with Melitta. A lordship and half the kingdom. That wouldn't turn him into a prince, but perhaps it would be enough for Melitta to consider allowing him to court her. He fought down a laugh. All he had to do was defeat a dragon and survive. Then he could beg the goddess of war for her hand. He knocked on Melitta's door but received no answer. He knocked a second time before calling her name. The door creaked ajar, revealing a red-eyed Melitta. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she wiped it away. The vile beast must die, she said through gritted teeth. George took a deep breath. On that, we agree. 33. Melitta could feel George's curiosity at her tears, but she couldn't seem to stop the flow. She'd opened her mind to the townspeople while she lay in the bath, and though she'd closed herself off from their thoughts since, their vast grief still roiled within her. Those girls. Those poor girls. That vile beast must die. George agreed wholeheartedly. How had she ever thought him a coward? Haltingly, she began her tale. The Tale of a City in Mourning. The words came slowly, describing the images lifted from so many minds, but the gist was the same. On the day the priests blessed the fleet in the name of Our Lady, they had led a great procession out of the city toward the river. In the forefront of the throng was a statue of the Blessed Virgin, carried by 4 virgin princesses dressed in white wool to match the robes on the statue. The dragon had flown overhead, as it did so often that they took little notice of it. It flew across the countryside, stealing and devouring sheep in the fields before retreating into its cave, only coming out when it hungered or some hero challenged it. That day had been different. Perhaps because they wore white wool, or perhaps the dragon was simply curious. He shot a gout of flame before him, enveloping the girls and the statue in searing heat. While the girls screamed, the beast had devoured them, and the statue too. The people of the city had watched in horror, before fleeing back inside the walls to hide from the dragon. On the morrow the king had offered to reward the dragon slayer with half his kingdom, but no one had claimed the reward. Even now, Melitta could feel the beast stomping about in the caverns beneath the city where it lived. Waiting. Watching. For who would be next? It was one thing for the beast to kill knights who challenged it, but another to kill and devour innocents. Those girls hadn't deserved to die. Melitta made up her mind. That dragon wouldn't understand honor if it climbed up its bottom. We're going to play dirty. George looked intrigued. How? What do you know about killing dragons? He shrugged. I know my namesake killed one with a sword, using a maiden for bait. I've always wondered about that. Melitta's anger rose, not at George but at his saintly namesake. So it seems even saints have no honor when it comes to killing dragons. Fine. But no maidens. We'll use a sheep. A sheep. Melitta took a deep breath and told George what she planned to do. 34. Feeling terribly exposed, George rolled the barrel to the mouth of the dragon's cave. He draped the sheepskin over it, and prayed that it would be enough to fool the beast. Once the bait was in place, George took to his heels and fled. Not to the city, but to a high vantage point where Melitta waited. Together, they crouched amid the leaves of an oak Melitta had chosen for its good view of the cave mouth. They didn't have to wait long. The dragon had heard George, and it emerged from the darkness, sniffing the air. George gulped. If the beast could smell him, it would find them. The beast lowered its snout and sniffed delicately at the woolly barrel. Then it opened its mouth, enveloping the barrel in searing flame. Oh no, Melitta murmured. While the barrel still burned, the dragon wrapped its tongue around it and tugged the whole thing into its mouth. Tipping its head back, the beast swallowed it whole. Yes. George didn't dare make a sound. Do you think we put enough arsenic in the barrel to kill a dragon? She asked. George shrugged. We filled it to the brim. That much poison could kill an army. Surely it's enough for a dragon. He didn't voice his biggest worry. How would they know if it was dead? If it was deep in the caves, he didn't want to go in after it, only to discover the beast was alive and well. Melitta tapped her head. I can feel it. Dragons are magical beasts and their minds are different. I don't even need to concentrate to hear its thoughts. I wish I could block it out. It's a vile creature. Like some humans, it enjoys killing. Now the true wait began. George did his best not to doze off, but it was hard. Melitta stayed alert, and she'd wake him when she could no longer sense the beast, surely. It's coming out. The poison is working, she said eventually, excitement burning in her eyes. A long moment later, George glimpsed movement inside the cave. The dragon staggered out, looking for all the world as if it had drunk too much ale. George held his breath. He could almost taste victory, it was so close. The dragon slumped to the ground, opening its mouth as if gasping for air. Fighting for its last breath. Good, George thought. Then it vomited up a steaming mess. Once. Twice. The dragon shook its head, coughed, then ambled back inside its cave. It's feeling better, Melitta whispered, sounding disappointed. George wanted to rage at the heavens. The dragon deserved to die in agony, not survive an attempt to poison it. Perhaps it's immune to poison. We'll have to try something else, she said. 35. In the common room of the inn that night, Melitta threw her hands up in despair. I don't know any more. I've never had to kill clever vermin before. Beg pardon, mistress. An elderly merchant rose from his seat and bowed in her direction. Did I hear you say you need to kill rats that are too clever? Melitta opened her mouth to tell the man to mind his own business. Because one of my warehouses had a terrible problem with rats, but my steward told me an old wives' tale he swore worked. See, poisoning works for a while, but then they grow wise to that, seeing their friends die when they eat poisoned food until none will touch it. You may try a new poison, but they'll learn about that too. My steward swore he knew a poison that they'd never suspect. He painted all the walls and containers with a white powder he called lime. Now the stuff's not poisonous on its own. Oh no. But it makes a body powerfully thirsty because it's salty, see. So the beasts eat it and think they're safe. Then they go for water, drinking as much as they can hold. And that's what kills him, because the water works some magic on the lime and they explode. Poof! He demonstrated with his hands. Exploding rats. What would he come up with next? Melitta forced down the retort she wanted to make, and tried to think of a way to thank him, so that he'd go away. You know that could work, George said, nodding. He raised his tankard. My thanks, sir. He signaled for the barman to get the man another drink. You're welcome. The man returned to his seat. Melitta eyed George. Are you serious? Or have you drunk too much wine? He's right about lime. If you throw a piece in a bucket of water, it bubbles and steams like it's boiling. If you put enough of that inside a dragon with a lot of water and whatever makes it breathe fire, you'd scald it from the inside out. Would a barrel be enough? George drained his tankard and smiled. On the morrow we shall see. 36. George rolled the barrel of lime to the mouth of the cave. This time they'd smothered the sheepskin in mutton fat to disguise the smell. He prayed it would work as he jogged back to Melitta's treetop perch. Once again, the dragon emerged and devoured the barrel disguised as a sheep before heading back into its cave. They didn't have to wait long before the beast ambled out again and headed for the river. George watched in satisfaction as it drank and drank. Surely when the water mixed with the lime, it would be enough. The dragon turned and made its way back toward its lair, more slowly this time, as if the mixture in its belly was affecting it. Now George tasted victory. True victory. Hey dragon, a voice roared. Come and fight me. A knight appeared, swaggering toward the beast with his sword held high. The dragon peered at the armored man, then staggered toward him. That idiot's going to steal our kill. George protested, climbing down as fast as he could go. Hey! You! That dragon's ours, he shouted as he sprinted toward the beast. Not fast enough. The dragon lowered its head and unleashed a gout of flame. The armored man screamed as flames enveloped him. Then the sound died and the smell of burning flesh reached George. The dragon turned its head, fixing one slitted eye on him. For a moment, George could have sworn recognition flared in that look. But it couldn't be. Dragons weren't that bright. Then a thick, muscled tail came out of nowhere and knocked him flat. Again. And the world went dark. Again. 37. Melitta reached the ground a moment behind George, but she was no match for him when it came to sheer speed. She suspected no man could beat him, so powerful was his godmother's gift. She wanted to shout after him, to warn him that the dragon wasn't weakened, that they couldn't have given it enough lime. But she could scarcely catch her breath as she ran. The armored knight became a human torch, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Tears of frustration sprang to her eyes, but she didn't slow. The dragon had seen George, and it knew him. And remembered. George was too busy looking at its head that he never saw the tail swing up, sending him flying. Then it lowered its head, drawing flame from deep in its belly to burn him to death too. "No you don't, you vile beast," she screeched. Charred armored corpses littered the ground, along with their weapons. Melitta picked up a short sword that looked about her size, though its blade was burned black. "Over here. Let's see if you can get this maiden." She flapped her woolen tunic. With agonizing slowness, the beast turned its head to regard her. Curiosity washed over her, but nothing more. The dragon didn't see her as a threat. Melitta reached down and picked up half a scorched steel breastplate that she slipped over her head. It was far too big, but that didn't matter. She clanged the sword against her armor. "I said over here." The dragon burped, releasing a fireball that scorched the ground for a dozen yards. Mercifully, it missed George. "Here," she screamed. She broke into a clumsy run, clanking with every step as she charged at the dragon. It lowered its head, breathing in deeply before belching flame. Her mind locked on the beast's, she read his intention in time and darted out of its path. The dragon bellowed, moving its ponderous bulk until it faced her again. Down went the head, and Melitta felt the inrush of air as though it reached her own lungs. Full to bursting. Couldn't breathe. It tried to flame, but nothing came out. Again it inhaled. And deep inside something ruptured. This time it was the dragon that screamed. Then all hell broke loose. 38. George raised his head slightly, wondering why he wasn't dead like the charred armored corpse beside him. He felt strange, like this had all happened before. He heard a scream, a sound so primal it couldn't have come from a human throat. And then the whole world was aflame. He threw himself flat to the ground to allow the blast to pass over him, praying that he'd survive it, as he must have before. Then the heat passed, and he allowed himself to look. Flames roared up into the sky from what looked like the carcass of a dragon, and out of the flames came a woman. No, a goddess, whose eyes burned like she'd harnessed hell itself. "Melitta?" George croaked. She smiled. "Oh good, you're not dead." She stabbed a finger behind her. "That bastard is, though. And good riddance." They'd killed the dragon. Well, she had, really, but had he ever doubted it? Melitta tugged off her breastplate, and let it clang to the ground. "We did it." Her smile was more radiant than the fireball behind her. George laughed. "We did. You're a hero, my lady." He clambered to his feet and brushed himself off. "So are you," she said. Then she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. George's world blazed white. This time he didn't want to wake up. 39. With her lips pressed against George's mouth and his arms holding her like the most precious thing in the world, Melitta surrendered to the moment. There was nothing more she wanted than to be here, now with him. The warmth of a fire at her back and the warmth of his love before her. Melitta broke away from his kiss, gasping. "Marry me," he said. She blinked. Surely she hadn't heard correctly. "I love you. Marry me, Lady Melitta. I could never love another woman the way I love you." Perhaps she had. Then his lips claimed hers again, and nothing else mattered. This was as mind-blowing as every kiss she had ever felt through someone else's thoughts, and yet it was so much more. Because she could feel it, burning within her. Hers. No one else's. "We're perfect for each other," she said breathlessly. She flapped a hand at the bonfire behind her. "Together, we can do anything." He laughed and scooped her up in his arms, spinning her around in a circle before heading toward the city. Any other day, Melitta might have scolded him and told him to put her down. But today, all she wanted was to feel his arms around her. "The sooner we get back to our lodgings the better, my lady," he said softly in her ear. Lodgings? Yes. Where there was a bed. A cheer rose up as they entered the city gates. "What's your name, sir?" a page in the king's livery asked. "George." "George, you are invited to a feast with the king, where he will grant you the reward you deserve for slaying the dragon," the page said, breathless with excitement. George's arms tightened around Melitta. "Tomorrow I will meet with the king. After I have been to my lodgings and changed into clothes more appropriate for the king's court." But not before Melitta got him out of his clothes and kept him that way for some time, she thought dreamily. Cheers and congratulations followed them all the way to the inn, until the door shut behind them. Still, George didn't set Melitta down until he climbed the stairs and reached the door to her room. She wound her arms around his neck and kissed him deeply. "I want a reward too," she said, trying to tug him into her chamber. "Tomorrow," George said. "No, tonight," Melitta said. "I want you tonight." George cupped her face in his hands. "My lady, your honor is as dear to me as my own. And I will not share your bed before the king grants us our rightful lands and titles. Only then will we have our true reward." He kissed her lips softly, a whisper of the passion they both felt. "Sleep well, my lady, and I will see you on the morrow." She stared after him as he headed for his own chamber and closed the door. Her lips still tingled from his kiss. Today had been the best day of her life. She sighed in blissful anticipation. And tomorrow would be better still. 40. As they broke their fast the following morning, another messenger arrived in the king's livery. He bowed low to George and said, "His most illustrious Majesty King Boleslas invites you to the castle for a feast to celebrate your victory over the dragon. There, before all his court, he will give you all the honors he has promised. You will be named a lord of half the kingdom." "We will be there," George replied. The messenger glanced at Melitta. He seemed lost for words for a moment, then added smoothly, "Of course a seat will be found at one of the lower tables for your squire." "I will see to it." The man hurried off. Melitta burst out laughing. "I know the light is dim in here, but did he really think I was a boy?" George smiled fondly. "How many maidens kill dragons? I'm sure in the light of day he could not fail to recognize your beauty." He frowned. "But you should be at my side, not at one of the lower tables. You earned this as much as I have, if not more. I've spent a lifetime sitting at the high table beside the queen. While a knight may wear what he will, a lady does not sit there without a fine gown. If I sat beside you like this I would shame you," she told him. What she didn't tell him was that she'd tasted the thoughts of everyone in town last night, and they all believed he was the hero who had slayed their dragon and that he had somehow saved her from the beast. Changing their minds and enlightening them with the truth would be harder than slaying the beast in the first place. A task Melitta would never be equal to, she feared. Let George receive the rewards and adulation. She would share them with him soon enough. "I am content. I will attend the feast as your squire. No fine gown required. And afterward, we will keep our promises to one another." George rose. "My first feast at court. My father would not believe it. He took a seat beside the fire. "It's a good thing I have you here to tell me how to behave, or I fear I would make some grave mistake." "I am sure you won't," Melitta said, sinking down by the fire. "I remember my first feast. I must have been 5 or 6. Mother and Queen, no, she was just Lady Margarita then, had gone without me, and left me in the care of 2 of the sisters from the priory. I screamed that I wanted to go, and because the sisters were to attend the harvest feast, they brought me along to the shuttered balcony where they could share the celebration apart from the revelers. I could scarcely sit still. All I wanted was to peer through the shutters at everyone. There was the harvest queen, dressed all in gold, though she was a farm girl who only got to be queen for one night. I thought she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and I wanted to be her, though my mother said I was too high-born for that. Then Lady Margarita stood up with King Eric, who was only a prince then but no less handsome, and joined the dance. Then I forgot the harvest queen and dinner and everything. All I wanted was to be a beautiful dancing lady with a prince of her own. I was a lady the same as she, or so I thought, and that was what my future held. I dreamed of dancing and princes and romance for many nights after that. Oh, the dreams of a little girl! Like something out of a fairy tale, where all princes are heroic and handsome and terribly in love with the lady of their dreams." Melitta peered into her empty cup, then tossed the dregs into the fire, where they hissed and spat. "It wasn't until a much later feast, where I was wearing as much silk as my mother, that I realized maybe I didn't want a prince or a husband at all." George drained his cup without looking at her. "So it's not true what you told me in the forest? The real reason why you ran away from home? Because your father was going to force you to marry a prince?" Melitta laughed so hard she nearly choked. "No, my father is dead. A saint, or so they tell me. And my mother will never force me into a marriage I do not want. She did want me to pick a husband though." "But you did run away." Melitta frowned. "You make it sound like I sneaked away in the dead of night, instead of in the morning light with my mother there to say farewell. I left the life I had because it dawned on me that I wanted to be my own hero, instead of waiting for some knight to save me and fall at my feet. And tonight I will feel like it is my first feast all over again. You will sit at the high table, and I will watch in anonymity from the lower tables. But this time I won't envy the ladies sitting up there with you." He bowed his head. "Very well, my lady. I find it difficult to believe that someone like you, who was promised a prince, could possibly choose a lowly shoemaker like me. If I were you, I would take the promised prince, for who can refuse royalty?" Melitta just smiled. There was no point telling him that when you could see in the minds of everyone, there was very little difference between a prince and a peasant. All men had hopes and dreams and desires, and she wanted the man who shared hers, no matter what his title. And tonight they would share everything. 41. When George took his seat at the high table, he had to admit it was a heady experience. Never had he seen so many people crowded into one room before, and all of them so richly dressed. He glanced down at his own simple clothes, but Melitta had assured him they were good enough. The court wanted to see a fighter, a hero, the man who had slayed their dragon Scourge. Still, it didn't help him to not feel self-conscious when everyone around him wore silks as bright as flowers, while he wore wool. Fine wool, for he could afford it, but wool nonetheless. And right now it made him itch like the coarsest stuff imaginable with all those eyes on him. How did Melitta stand such scrutiny? Only now did he understand why she didn't want to sit at the high table. So many people staring. Then the food was served, and it wasn't so bad. The king had seated him on the end, beside a girl in blue who said nothing and refused to look at him. How he would have preferred to have Melitta by his side. And when they were married, he would. Not even the king would refuse to give his lady all the honors that were due to her. George scanned the crowded tables, looking for the only woman he wanted. Past the courtiers, knights and their ladies, the colors grew duller as the benches were filled with men-at-arms, no women there. Except Melitta. She perched on the end of a bench near the window, nibbling at something on the point of her dagger. The men at the table, no boys, all of them, he realized. Squires to the knights most likely. The boys ignored her, talking among themselves and paying her no attention at all. George raged at them. Didn't they realize they had a hero in their midst? A lady no less, who had slayed a dragon? Evidently not, for they all laughed at something one of the boys had said, while she sat there calmly. The food was plentiful and the wine flowed freely, though George partook sparingly of both. He didn't want to make a fool of himself when the king called him up to receive his reward. What if he stumbled and fell? Or said something that offended the king? By all that was holy, he needed Melitta by his side, helping him. He was nothing without her. And yet, she sat at the other end of the hall, oblivious to his eyes on her. What if she changed her mind? George fretted through the interminable feast, heartily wishing he never had to attend another. Maybe this was what Melitta meant about not missing such things. How much food and wine could a man consume? Surely they were all sated by now, he thought, but servants kept bringing out more platters and jugs. Finally, King Borislas rose to his unsteady feet. He'd had more to drink than most, George judged, watching him sway. "My subjects," the king cried. "Lord, ladies, knights, men. We are here to celebrate a great victory. Sir George had defeated the dragon that oppressed us for so long." He raised his cup in a toast. The whole hall cheered and drank with him as he emptied his cup. "And he shall be rewarded." More cheers, even louder still. "Kneel, Sir George." This was the part Melitta had explained to him in painstaking detail. He hoped he didn't forget anything. George dropped to one knee before the king, then pulled his sword out of its scabbard. He laid the blade across his open palms and held the weapon out. "I pledge my honor and obedience to you, your majesty. My life to your service, as God is my witness." George prayed he'd remembered the words right. Melitta had said it didn't matter if he made a mistake. No two men seemed to state their vow of service in the same way. King Borislas inclined his head and took the proffered sword. Wrapping both hands around the hilt, he muttered some words in Latin that George didn't understand. He finished with, "Rise, Lord George, and take up your blade in my service." He presented George's sword hilt first back to him. George slid the blade back into its scabbard, as Melitta had advised him. With his back to the hall, he couldn't see if she was smiling or shaking her head in mortification. The hall erupted in more cheering, so he hoped he hadn't made too great a fool of himself. "And as a final reward for his heroism, I have decided to bestow my only remaining daughter, Princess Sativa, on him in marriage, this very night. My personal confessor and priest will marry them in the castle chapel after the feast, and if I'm not mistaken, Lord George will have an heir on the way before the night is through." Laughter and cheering echoed through the hall as men toasted George's marriage and virility. Even the priest rose to his feet, and he nearly fell over, he was so drunk. King Borislas ushered the girl in blue forward to kneel beside George. He spouted more Latin, then announced that he had blessed their union. George's mouth was dry, and not in a good way. He couldn't marry the princess. Couldn't accept her as a bride. It was Melitta he wanted, no one else. The princess beside him continued to ignore him, just as she had for the rest of the feast. He couldn't marry a girl who pretended he didn't exist, no matter how grateful her father was. "And when God sees fit to end my reign, Lord George will ascend the throne in my place." George could have sworn his heart dropped right into his boots. Heir to a throne? No. Not him. This was preposterous. He was barely even a hero. He couldn't be a king. "As my heir, you must sit at my right hand, Lord George." People shuffled along the benches at the high table to make space for George, who staggered to take his place beside the king. Now who will be the first to declare their oath of loyalty to Lord George? King Borislas declared, his gaze sweeping the hall. Courtiers rushed from their seats to be the first, crowding before the high table so that George couldn't see past them. Melitta. What would she think of this? Being a lord was one thing, but one day a king. She didn't like court. She would never consent to be a queen. And then there was the matter of the princess he didn't want. But how could he tell a king that his daughter wasn't good enough to be his bride? George would be lucky to keep his head. Melitta would know what to do. Melitta would help him deal with this mess. Unless she believed he had thrown her aside to marry the princess. He rose onto his toes, straining to look past the crowd so that he might see her, catch her eye and beg for her help. But she was nowhere in sight. George's world crumbled around him. Without her, he had nothing. 42. As benches scraped and men rose to pay their respects to their new overlord, Melitta made her way to the back of the hall. She knew good manners decreed that she should congratulate George on his good fortune and on his bride, but she wasn't sure that anything she said would be considered good manners tonight. She climbed the stairs to her chamber where she packed up the little she had, and decided to leave George a note. It would be hours before the dragon-slaying lord would find it, by which time she would be well away, she was certain. What need did he have for her, anyway? He had his bride, his lands, his lordship, everything he had ever wanted. Melitta fought down a sob. He didn't need and definitely didn't want her. After all, who'd choose a mere lady when he could have a princess? He'd said as much this morning. Even last night, he'd hinted that it wouldn't have been honorable to give in to their desires. She'd thought he meant delaying by a day, but evidently she'd misunderstood. Instead, he'd meant that today he would marry a princess, and she would have what? Permission to watch? Melitta wanted to give him a piece of her mind about that too. Yet when she faced the empty piece of parchment with a quill in hand, she still did not know what to say. She had to write something she knew. Dipping her quill in the ink, Melitta forced herself to write what was right. I congratulate you, Lord George, she wrote. My best wishes for your future health and happiness. Should you ever have need to hire a slayer of monsters, you will find me. Here she stopped. For where would he find her? Her first thought was to return home, as she had promised her mother, but Melitta wasn't sure she could go back to her old life. She liked the adventure of the life she had led since she left home. She would not easily give up her leathers for silks once more. Finally she wrote, you will find me where I am needed most. Vague, but probably the best she could come up with at the time, she decided. She sealed the scroll with a blob of wax and left it on the table in her room. It was all she left behind, for little remained of her childish dreams of love, marriage and happiness. Shouldering her saddlebags, Melitta headed down to the stables. She would saddle her horse and be gone before anyone thought to ask for her. By the time George read her message and thought to look for her, she would be safely asleep in an inn in the next town. Perhaps if she was lucky, she would have already found information about her next quest. Unbidden, a smile sprang to her lips at the thought. The people of Casmiris might not believe a maiden could slay monsters, but she would show them. She was a dragon slayer now. The stables were surprisingly quiet, for all that they were full of horses. Oh, the horses made plenty of noise, but there was no one about. Even the stable hands were off celebrating this night. After all, it wasn't every day someone slayed a dragon that had plagued your city. The whole city was celebrating. Yet Melitta heard the clink of harness and was instantly on the alert. Who's there? She demanded, sliding her dagger from its sheath. Show yourself. The clinking ceased, but no one appeared. Melitta was not fooled. Carefully, she bit her lip and sent her thoughts out, questing for the mind of what she suspected was a horse thief. But the jumbled mind she touched was no thief at all. I will not be a prize, the distinctly feminine thoughts repeated to herself. I will not be handed over as a prize. I am a princess, not some bauble. Melitta's horse thief could be none other than the Princess Sativa, George's intended bride. An unwilling bride, Melitta realized uneasily. Forgetting her own hurry to leave, Melitta made her way to the stall where the princess hid behind a horse. Princess? Melitta ventured. Why are you not at the feast, celebrating with everyone else? Melitta had to give the girl credit. The princess stepped out of hiding, her chin held high. You shall not stop me, the girl insisted. I am not a prize to be won. I will not be handed to that shoemaker in marriage, like some pretty bauble. Melitta balked at the girl's tone. George is no mere shoemaker, she said, frowning. True, he was once a master shoemaker. But he is also a hero, a slayer of monsters and giants. He has saved maidens and whole towns from monsters. And he slayed a dragon at the very gates to your city. Your father has seen fit to make him a lord and give him lands to match. Any girl would be lucky to be allowed to marry such a man. Melitta had to swallow hard against the lump in her throat as she said this. She would consider herself lucky to marry George, lordship and lands notwithstanding. This spoiled princess, royalty though she might be, did not deserve him. I will not be a prize, the princess repeated stubbornly. Only then did Melitta realize that the clinking harness she had heard was the saddle and bridle the horse behind the princess now wore. The princess would rather flee than marry George. He does not love me, the princess continued. Though I sat beside him, he scarcely even looked at me. He had eyes for only one person in the feasting hall. She glared at Melitta. You. The one he calls his squire, but you are more than that, aren't you? You are his lover. Melitta tried hard not to laugh. She loved him, she knew that. But she had never shared his bed, not in the way the princess meant, and now she never would. For he was to marry this girl, and Melitta was nothing to him. I am not his lover. I am his partner, in that we slayed the dragon together. We have slayed many beasts together, but I think his hero days are done. Lover or not, his heart belongs to you, the princess said bitterly. You shall not stop me. I ride to the coast, and my betrothed. A man who loves me, or at least he did once. Melitta's heart ached for the girl, for she saw herself in this proud princess. Both fled their homes in search of a better life they imagined lay outside the castle, though they sought very different things. Which was a sillier goal though, love or a dragon? Melitta couldn't suppress a smile. A dragon of course, for she knew love existed. So did Princess Sativa. Take only what you need with you, Melitta urged. Food, water, weapons and clothes that are suited for rough travel. Nothing that will mark you for what you are, because there are men on the roads who will take advantage of a lady. They will see you as even more of a prize. Melitta was tempted to tell the girl exactly what sort of prize those brigands had thought her, but she wasn't sure even that would make the princess change her mind. After all, Melitta had known, but she'd gone anyway. You would be safer in your father's castle. The princess drew herself up. What would you know of it? A girl pretending to be a squire knows nothing of the cage that is a royal court. Melitta laughed. Forgive me, your royal highness, but I was raised in a royal court, a princess in all but name, alongside Queen Margarita's own children. And I could take my place at her side again tomorrow if I wished. But I will not leave these walls without my armor, my weapons, and enough money and provisions for the journey, because I know there are monsters out there. She pulled a dagger from its ankle sheath and held it out to Princess Sativa. Take it, princess, for I promise you will have need of it. Sativa swept aside her cape, revealing two sheathed daggers strapped to her girdle. I am not a fool. Melitta sincerely hoped the girl was right. Still, she dug through her bag until she found a clean tunic and hose. Then at least take these. Court dresses will be no use to you on your journey. Sativa hesitated, then took the clothing. I thank you. But I must repay you, and I will need all the coin I have for my journey, as you say. Wait. She disappeared back into the horse stall. Melitta fought not to tap her foot in impatience. Finally the princess emerged, wearing Melitta's spare clothes. They are finer than they look. Here, consider this a gift. She thrust a wad of silk at Melitta. I have no need for silk, Melitta replied, realizing too late that she held the princess's feast gown. Oh no! I cannot wear this. Every priest in the city is so drunk they cannot tell the difference between one woman and another. Yet in an hour my father will command one of them to conduct a wedding, marrying me to the shoemaker. If you wear this, they will think you are me. Marry the man, if that is your wish. By morning it will be too late for anyone to do anything. I will be gone and you will be his wife. Sativa's eyes implored her. Please? My lady? Are you here or am I too late? A male voice called. George. The princess paled. He cannot catch me here. He will stop me. A princess too proud to beg for help. Melitta made no attempt to hide her smile. Rescuing maidens in distress was what heroes did, and she was every bit as much a hero as George. Who had eyes for only one woman at the feast, him? Perhaps Melitta might stay after all and marry such a man. And in so doing save a princess. Lifting her chin, Melitta marched out of the stables. Lord George, she greeted him. George sagged in relief. Thank God. I thought you'd left. Melitta, I swear I didn't know about the princess. I must speak to the king, tell him I cannot. Melitta silenced him with a wave of her hand. Ah, but you can. I have it on good authority that the princess will not attend your wedding. But I have a mind to. Give me a moment, for I must be properly dressed. They found an empty chamber, and George guarded the door while Melitta changed into the princess's gown. The silk felt strange against her skin after so long in linen, leather and wool. And yet when she laced up the overdress, it felt as familiar as anything she'd worn at home. She looked down at the shimmery blue silk embroidered with gold thread, reminiscent of one of Queen Margarita's gowns. A wedding dress fit for a queen or a princess. Too much for a mere lady, a girl who chased dragons and unicorns. Melitta swallowed, then pushed open the door. George turned slowly, his eyes taking her in. My lady. He bowed so low, his head nearly touched the ground. Never have I seen a woman more lovely. She heard the clop of a horse's hooves, trotting across the bailey and out the gate. For good or ill, Princess Sativa had left in search of love or her destiny. Far more sensible than searching for dragons, Melitta now knew. Her eyes met George's and they shared the same thought, though George's inability to read minds made him voice it. There was a drunk priest I passed on my way here. If you are willing, Lady Melitta, he began. A drunk priest, you say? Then I am more than willing, Melitta replied warmly, linking her arm through George's and leading him back to the feasting hall. They paused outside so that George could help her cover her hair with the princess's veil. When he was satisfied that it was straight, they stepped into the hall together. In almost no time at all, Melitta knelt beside George in the castle chapel, trying to make sense of the priest's words as he slurred through the ceremony. King Boreslas and his court crowded into the room, talking so loudly they made it almost impossible to hear the priest. Melitta? George prompted. Oh yes I do, Melitta replied. More mumbling as the priest wrapped his stole around their joined hands, before he uttered something that ended with the word, wife. Melitta rose, dusting off her knees. She had saved the hero from the princess, just like something in a fairy tale. Godspeed, princess, she said softly. What? George asked. Oh, nothing. "Let's head for your bedchamber before this drunken rabble decide to follow us," Melitta said. "I want you all to myself tonight." George grinned. "I was thinking the same thing, my lady." 43. Melitta was breathless by the time they reached George's chamber. She didn't want to let go of his hand, but she reluctantly did so when she realized he needed both hands to properly bar the door against intruders. For a moment, George put his back to the door and just drank her in. Being stared at so intently while she wore another woman's ill-fitting dress was disconcerting, to say the least. "I have chests full of dresses like this back in my mother's apartments. Ones that fit me far better, for mother and I made them for me. Once we decide where we shall live, I can send for them. Or we could go fetch them." Her voice trailed off into silence as George stepped forward to claim a kiss. "And another one." And she soon forgot everything about clothing until he said, "My lady, I confess that while you look beautiful in it, the only desire I have for your gown is to extract you from it." She laughed and helped him undo the lacings. His hands were so warm through the thin silk it was almost like wearing nothing at all, until she found she really did wear nothing at all. She'd never been naked before a man before. Melitta folded her arms across her breasts, suddenly shy. George was too busy shucking off his own clothes to notice. His surcoat, his tunic and even his hose lay on the flagstones, on top of the puddle of silk she'd shed. His strong arms lifted her, carrying her to the bed. "I've dreamed of this," he said. Melitta swallowed. "I know." He laughed ruefully. "Of course. So you know that I am no expert at loving a woman, but I would like you to enjoy it." He reddened. So did Melitta. I am no expert either, as you know this is my first time. But I have touched the minds of many couples when they couple. And I think I know what I might like, or at least what I would like to try." At first she guided his hands over her breasts and between her thighs, letting out little gasps of pleasure as with each touch, he awoke desires in her she'd never felt before. It was one thing to taste another's desire, but something else entirely to be devoured by her own. She began to moan as George's fingers found a rhythm inside her that built and built and built to a climax that made her cry out. When Melitta descended from on high, she knew only one thing: she wanted more. More of him inside her, and more of the pleasures only he could give her. "My lady," he began, looking concerned. Melitta pressed a finger to his lips. "I'm not your lady yet. First you must fill me with more than your fingers, and then, when you are all mine, only then will I be yours." "As my lady wishes," he replied with a mischievous glint in his eye. He grasped her hips, spreading her thighs wide. Melitta closed her eyes. This would hurt for only a moment, she knew, and then George's tongue darted inside her, licking and sucking at tender flesh until she cried out anew. "George!" Slowly he withdrew, wiping his mouth with his hand. "When you are all mine, I want to hear you call me your lord." Melitta inclined her head. "We have an accord." Her mouth was dry in anticipation, but Melitta had no desire to drink. She wanted George, and if he was willing. "Will you lie on your back? I would like to try something. Something that had made other women scream with pleasure. Something their lovers had enjoyed too." "As you desire, my lady." George flopped onto the furs, folding his arms behind his head. Now she could truly take in the man she had married, in all his naked glory. Oh, she knew he was all lean hard muscle, but one in particular drew her attention more than the others right now. She ran her fingers down his length, gently stroking him as she'd seen herself do in his dreams. He groaned a little, thrusting his pelvis into her willing hands. She could give him pleasure with nothing but her hands, she knew, but neither of them would be satisfied with that. Not tonight. Shivering in anticipation at her own daring, she climbed atop him. If she stroked him and he thrust his hips again in the same manner, he would be inside her. Melitta made up her mind and reached down. George laughed and grasped her hips as he thrust upward without warning. The tiniest sting, a mere needle prick, healed in a moment, was over before it had barely begun, and she could think only of the heat of him, the hardness of his length as he drove into her. Slowly, masterfully, in control of every moment as he watched her reaction. Melitta closed her eyes, lost in his love and the sheer sensation of making love and being made love to, for the first time. Steadily another climax built within her as she felt the same need for release radiating from George. She knew he was close when he drove into her that penultimate time, sending her soul careening out among the stars. Yet she squeezed him within her and felt his mind fly up alongside hers. The joint sensation was so exquisite, it surpassed anything she imagined even heaven could offer. "Oh God," she cried as George groaned his pleasure aloud. Then she heard him laugh. "No, not a god. Just your lord, my lady. As you are mine." She squeezed him again and was surprised to discover it shot a little bolt of pleasure through her own loins. "My lord," she repeated. "I hope you plan on more love-making tonight and every other night, because as long as you are my lord, I will want you in my bed." She winced as George withdrew and went to clean himself up. "I will grant your wish, my lady, but I have one wish of my own." "Oh." Melitta tried to keep her face blank, as the thought of all the things men liked their lovers to do in bed. She hoped he wasn't about to ask her to. "In the interests of remaining your lord for as long as possible, I have one question about the dozen who died by your single blow." Melitta swallowed. "Oh. That. What did they do to offend you so, that they needed to die?" She wet her lips. "They tried to steal my honey from me." His eyebrows flew up. "Honey? God forbid I ever try to steal your honey. I shall devote the rest of my life to providing you with every kind of sweetness you might desire, and defending you from anyone who might try to steal from you. May you never need to land another blow again." It was her turn to laugh. "Not even if we hear of another dragon that must be slain." "Dragons are different." He lay down beside her once more. "And while I have never seen a lady look more beautiful in silk than you did tonight, I cannot get the vision out of my head of you, yesterday, slaying that dragon and striding out of the flames like a goddess. Why, just the memory is enough to reinvigorate me for another round or two at least." "Another?" Melitta followed his gaze and blushed. "I wanted to throw you down on the ground outside that cave and have my way with you," she admitted. "Then you must have been reading my mind." He entered her again, chuckling at her gasp of delight, and between his tender lovemaking and passionate kisses, Melitta didn't care whether the thoughts in her head were his or her own. She loved him, and if he was the prize for slaying a dragon, the rest of the dragons in the world could go on living, for she had the most perfect happy ending to her very own fairy tale, without a prince or princess in sight. This has been Embellish. Brave Little Tailor Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.